Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. We are so delighted that Mother Nature cooperated with us for this morning, that we can see all your faces here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lisa Melandri. I'm the executive director here at CAM and the curator for the exhibition Christine Corday Relative Points, which has been a pleasure, a privilege, and a very exciting kind of story of how sculptural work can sort of evolve and transform, and how it gets into the very form that it is in here. I am going to give you a bit of an introduction of Christine, and I've put it together in a way that I think gives you a picture of why Christine Corday, as an artist, is particularly interesting for her own trajectory. So I'm just going to read you a bunch of things, and it's pretty interesting. So she was born, you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So she was born in Laurel, Maryland, but spent part of her childhood here in St. Louis, and so there's a real connection with this place and this space. She was trained as a classical pianist. She received an astrophysics internship with NASA when she was 21. She took courses in cultural anthropology at WashU. As a graphic and structural designer in her 20s, she received a design award and patent for the Republic of Tea bottle with Scuzio Design in St. Louis. So you're getting this incredible picture of all of these different kinds of things. She's a short story prize winner in Zoetrope magazine, a finalist for National Poetry Prize, which happened in her 30s. She's a relative of Charlotte Corday, who killed Marat in his bath. But then we can move on to these extraordinary moments in her career as an artist and as somebody who has made not only important work, but work that has resonated for different kinds of audiences in different places. She was part of the National September 11th Memorial Project at One World Trade Center, creating the color for the bronze name parapets, and with a colleague, applied blackening color over the memorial for 9 months. We'll talk about that. Genesis, a major commission just installed at the Moscone Center in San Francisco, is also a work that we will look at. And when I talk about that, I talk about it from the point of view of being indeed monumental public sculpture. She had an exhibition at LACMA that featured her Protoist series, 2 different selected forms, also that we will talk about. And this is a place where, like with Un under the High Line many years ago, is a kind of sculptural intervention into space that is not only monumental, but is very much about the body and people and the way that we interact with those spaces. And I'll also say that over a very long, varied, interesting career, she has often been the only woman in the room. So before we start talking about this trajectory, it is essential that I make my thanks for all of those people who have supported this exhibition and made it happen and brought it to St. Louis. My profound thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts for both the exhibition and the forthcoming catalog, which we are so delighted that we will be able to offer with the documentation of this exhibition and of Christine's work in general. It will be her sort of first monographic publication. That's really wonderful. My deep and abiding thanks to Barrett Barrera Projects and Susan Barrett for support also of the exhibition and the forthcoming catalog. My thanks to Penny Pennington and Michael Fiddler, to Alexandria and Peter Strelo, to Ann Ruich and John Fox Arnold for their support of this exhibition. These are the kinds of shows that are undertakings, heavy ones, big ones, that we certainly couldn't do without the people behind them. And today's talk is actually sponsored by the Robert Lehman Foundation, and we are very grateful to be able to bring artists to our community and to be able to hear from them directly, and so we thank Robert Lehman Foundation very much for these opportunities. So with that, we're going to get started, and what we thought we would do is take a bit of a look at Christine's evolution as an artist and how we then get to what you see here. And I think that that is really helpful in informing kind of why this form, why this space, why this material. So we're going to start, and I'm going to ask questions, and you're going to talk to us about it.
One other thing, if someone else would like to take a seat, there is a stair right here under a relative point that if you would like, just to say, if you don't want to stand.
It definitely has some presence, but we promise that the entirety of the exhibition is beautifully and securely installed. There's no need for fear at any point here, so please. So we wanted to sort of start with, I read this kind of little strange points of a resume that speak to a creative endeavor that goes from the written word to music to all of these different kinds of things. And one of the things that we don't really talk about is any sort of traditional art training, art school, anything like that. And yet you sort of think of your career as an artist really beginning with being a painter. And so we're showing some early works, 2006 here, that are indeed paintings. But what I would love is for you to just talk a little bit about, first of all, how you came to painting, why you came to this kind of expression, creative expression, and perhaps more importantly, as we kind of look forward and get ourselves over here, tell me about paint. Tell me about pigment for you and why this is a beginning point.
So my entry into becoming an artist, I think, just to answer the first part of the question, there was a North American or maybe a United States definition of what it was to be an artist that I wasn't fully satisfied with. So I wanted to inform that definition by living in different places in this very small world of ours. So I did set about time in some other countries to absorb the definition of what it meant to be artist from their cultural standpoint. And from that, I began to understand that art was truly a cultural infrastructure. So after spending some time and about 5 or 6 years away from the United States when I returned, I began to make paint. I began to make my own paint. I wasn't doing that when I was abroad. And by making my own paint, this was a journey into my medium, far deeper than I thought that I would go. But given the fact that I had a bit of a science past, I think I could connect the dots on why I did that. But when you're making paint, I don't know how many of you in this room do, but you'll know what I'm talking about. You're not really truly manipulating the pigment. As a sculptor, I really want to get my hands on what I'm working with. And you have to keep going deeper and deeper as to what does that really mean. As a painter making my own paint, I realized that as I'm taking the pigments, all I'm doing, even when I'm mulling them, right, I'm putting all of this pressure on these pigments, all I'm doing is suspending them, just suspending them. No matter how much I'm touching them, I'm just suspending them in a medium, in another medium. So this was like this endless interest that got me into this idea of, well, if I look at elements, like metal elements, right? Think of the periodic table of elements. So if I look at elements like I do pigments, then as a sculptor, all I'm really doing is suspending elements in different states. Okay, that's how sculpture happened. But with paint, I dove headlong into paint. I dove headlong into the making of paint. I also became really preoccupied, although you see a work there in white, which is an important work for me. The predominance of my work was in iron oxides. So at the time, I didn't really realize that I was working with metals. Elemental metals, I like to think of it that way. So as I'm working with these pigments, I was already sculpting and I was making paint. So I was already a sculptor.
And you were also working at a pretty significant scale.
Yes.
So, maybe not always, but this is a perfect example of something where the monumental, not just in its materials, but
yes, That's such a great point. I think often my work could be better understood in a different context with this, which is, thank you for that question. So, spending time abroad, when you have ideas in the different cultures that I was living in, the United States calls those ideas ambitious. Living in these other cultures, it was just vision, right? So the context of the scale I was working in was in two levels. One, having just even dabbled a bit in astronomy, already, and when you're dealing in astronomy, you're dealing with monumental scales, right? And you're also dealing with metals. So one thing that I didn't know until I got involved in astronomy is that although we mine metals, right, on Earth, they didn't source there. They just coalesced there. Where they're sourced, where they're made, where they're forged is in the cores of stars. Oh my God. That was mind-blowing for me. That was mind-blowing. And which got me further and further into astronomy to understand this whole metallurgy, the medium within the medium. And so for me, yes, these paintings, their measurements might be considered large, but really on a scale, things are always larger than other things. Other things are always smaller than other things.
Hold on, we're having a technical difficulty.
Oh, it's okay. We're just making a point.
Well, it was you saying that your mind was blown
just
by the incredible
Just hang
sense
out there
of
in the
scale.
static for just a minute.
Just kind of put a point on it for us there. Okay, please continue.
So the scale is neither, it's not ambitious. I'm not making a statement. I'm not inserting something into the world with this sense of will or ego in that way. It's just the scale that I became very familiar with working as an astronomer. So, of course, the measurements were going to fill my walls in my studio. I literally would take a piece of canvas and I would be stapling it to the very edges of my wall. Didn't want to be confined by my studio and just begin. So, yeah.
And that brings us to the actual physical transition to the making of sculpture, right? What you would call and define as sculpture, monumental sculpture, also about elemental metals, so still about these materials, et cetera. This is Un. This is a space under the High Line that you realized in 2008. And I think there are a couple of things that, as you're kind of looking at your trajectory as an artist, what's interesting is this kind of appears as the beginning of your artistic lexicon, your vocabulary. You are making these paintings, you have this background, and all of a sudden, you are now a monumental metal sculptor, right? And there's an extraordinary history if we think through art history of what does that mean and what is that tradition and what does that come out of. And you can't even begin to have that conversation, just for the sake of this discussion even, without, thinking about that magnificent thing that's right across the courtyard at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, the Richard Serra Joe. And again, this kind of historic idea of what does metal sculpture mean. So it's something pretty significant to take on. It's something pretty significant to take on, particularly as an artist who, in this medium, is really self-taught, which is the case for you.
Of course, yes.
And so I think what would be really helpful is to think about, why that form, why that site, how it's made, and what your interest is, and a little bit about how does this fit in to this long lineage of your forebears? Where is it the same? Where is it really different?
So, Un is my first sculpture, and that is my first show. So the path isn't a traditional path. So how Un came to be as my first sculptural form is, so as I was saying, imagine these canvases stapled and taped to the edges of, the walls of my studio. And just from the interest of trying to get deeper into the medium of how I'm working, from a scientific perspective, I knew that the impact of the mark is I'm applying room temperature paint to room temperature canvas, and I'm having that kind of conversation. I wanted to have more impact with the mark. I wanted to go deeper into the medium, so I realized I was going to have to start playing with things like temperature. So how can I increase the intensity of that mark? Well, I can start playing with the transfer of energy, the temperature. And that's when it occurred to me that I could replace paint with heat. So what Un is a canvas of elemental metals with a single stroke of using heat as paint. So if you were to navigate Un, to experience Un, it is really a blueprint that was sourced from my paintings. So this is where this whole back and forth happens between painting, sculpture, painting, sculpture, painting, sculpture. Not really seeing too much of a differentiation as far as me working with the medium. My only focus is on that material. I'm always trying to figure out, as a sculptor, or whatever, maybe there's another term for it, as an artist, getting my hands on this wrangly thing called the medium within the medium.
But regardless of your process in making that, you need us.
Yes. So there's two things about this. In order to be able to realize Un, I realized that it needed to have many more hands than my own. My studio has no equipment for this. I had no idea of how to do this, but I was in the right place. I was in New York City. And so I would set about trying to figure out how one could go to make this. I did meet my husband in the process, who came to be my husband in the process.
Who's a fabricator?
Who is a fabricator.
Yeah.
And not just any fabricator.
Right, exactly.
But also the site of showing Un under the High Line. Again, getting back to that idea of art as a cultural infrastructure. I loved the idea of being able to play with this relic of what the High Line used to be, what it was connecting on the west side of Manhattan, what it was serving, what it was doing. And now it was just a relic. This was actually a year before the art program began at the High Line. So this preceded the formal program that now exists.
Can you talk a little bit about when I say it takes us to complete it, right? So that people are very much kind of a part.
The surface,
The
touch.
surface, and also, what is that? What is that cut?
Yes. Okay, so as an artist in the studio, I'm engaged with the work, not only with my eyes, but with my hands, with a full sensory apparatus. The person also experiencing it has to have the same experience, otherwise they're shut out. Like, what's the point? So for me, I lifted that veil immediately. So I wanted the surface to be informed by that interaction. I also became very interested at what happens in touch. Touch is our largest sensory organ. It's not our eyes, it's our flesh. That is our asymplastic sense of self. It is what defines our identity. So I wanted to engage that. That is our largest sensory organ. So touch became important. The surface was raw. The acids and the oils from your fingertip will create the rust, will burnish it, will do who knows what. But that was the important part, was the experiencer is actually creating the surface. There is a conversation of memory. Your memory is being left on the surface of it is being left on your finger. There's that exchange as well. But the reason for the form is in my paintings, if you think of this as a canvas, I wanted to suspend the mark making. I wanted to be able to enter it and exit it. In order to do that, then we're curving. This also has to do with temperature. So the idea of Un is you're navigating through its center. You're entering the mark and you're exiting the mark. And you're being suspended in a moment between sensory stimulus and definition. On a side note, if there's any neurologists in the audience, when we receive billions of stimulus every second, I'm not saying that we can have a conscious moment in that. I know that there's a lot of automatic editing processes that happen in the brain that we're not even aware of. But from an artistic perspective, just the idea of taking that pause. If you're touching something that is unknown to you, to let that be an opportunity to slow down before you're so automatic to define it. It's a kind of a fearless state to be because we want to define things pretty quickly. But it's also a very expansive space to be, to allow being aware and present in an unknown and allowing that to then inform how you define it. So Un is that suspension, right? Physically walking through it. I did notice that there was no formal opening for this, right? This was truly just like, okay, what's this doing here? People had to really give themselves a lot of permission to step up and then actually walk through it. Mm-hmm. And that was always very interesting to me, to watch that process of self-permission, also the self-permission to be able to touch it and to inform its surface.
And this work exists, obviously, still. And part of its kind of evolution through different places, and we'll see it again at LACMA, what has become of the surface? What are the marks that people have left? How has it changed?
Oh, okay. There are fingerprints. There are marks from skaters and bikers. There's marks from the feet of Alvin Ailey dancers. There is every single thing that has ever happened has been recorded. But also the temperature of the place, in the atmosphere, it can rust and then it can be burnished. If it's dry, like out in Los Angeles, human touch was actually burnishing over itself. It came back almost bronze. When it was in New York City, it was just rusting, and there was this beautiful drip from the High Line that was just dripping on the surface, and you see this splash mark of rust, and it's just, you just have to let go and just see what happens. It's just a recording device in that way.
Just a detail.
This is a detail. So this is back in that talk of how pigments, you're just really suspending it. This is a cut in metal, suspending a moment between the element in a liquid state and in a solid state. And this is that suspension, right? This is that moment of the sensory unknown, just allowing yourself to have a moment between material states.
So just briefly, because I think this is really important in terms of thinking about the way that you never stop thinking about the actual materials. Right? Even though you're changing the idea of what the forms are, what things look like, what your mark is, etc. I think this is really important because it goes back to thinking about how you are interested in making your own paint, making your own surfaces, making your own recipes for these sculptures, right? However you want to kind of call it. And so can you just talk a little bit about what we're actually looking at here?
Okay, so this is going to be a little intense for me to talk about. Sorry.
Do you want me to skip it?
No, don't skip it.
Okay.
I'm here. All right, so this is the National September 11th Memorial. I had the opportunity to work on this. So how this happened is, and this is also based off of, ironically, this is one of the largest touchable surfaces, one of the largest touchable metal surfaces. It's 15,000 square feet. From a lineage of work, this really fit in to what I had been working with for many years, not only with the idea of working with iron pigments, because the recipe for the memorial actually is based on that recipe that I was working with for so many years in my studio, which I had no idea that the end result was going to be on the memorial. To also the aspect of touch and how touch is going to inform this piece. And this isn't just, this is not an artwork. This is, almost 3,000 lives, that I was very aware of, each and every one, as working on this piece. I had the pleasure of working on it. My now husband, who then was not my husband, Christopher Powers, who is in the audience, is the fabricator and installer of the National September 11th Memorial. That in itself, there's documentaries on the History Channel and Discovery Channel about him and about that work. I saw an opportunity, there was an opportunity because the architect, Michael Arad, was looking for a very specific color and feel for the memorial. And he had been working with many, many people over a period of many years in trying to do that. Because of my chemistry background and because I was very, very comfortable working with this, this was something that I felt comfortable with after working about 6 months with different labs, that I could put forward an idea. I presented it, it was chosen, and then I went about trying to create a team, like an incredible team of people who could apply this with the heat and the technique in order to be able to blacken the surface. And ironically, I got no's. All my phone calls to people who had been doing this for decades turned it down. So it ended up, I trained somebody who was an artist. I trained her, and she and I patinated the entire 15,000 square feet in 9 months. And that is the story on that. And it was a great pleasure and a great honor to work on that, because at the end of the, realizing that it was just going to be the two of us, then I took a great responsibility to make sure that it was done fully aware and fully honoring each person. Yeah.
So now we come back to Un, but here it is in a completely different setting at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art at an exhibition that Christine had there, 2014, 2015. And interestingly, this is now, significant number of years later. A lot of what you had been talking about, you can see the differentiation in the surfaces even from that earlier image. And I do want to kind of put a significant point on this to say there are two kinds of what I might call metal public sculptors. There are those who want, relish, and truly are desirous of the changes that we as people can make to the surfaces, and that the rain and the snow and the wind and all of those things can make, and others who want the thing to keep living the way it was made. And I say this again because I think this is something that really differentiates this kind of work from a lot of what I'm talking about in that lineage of, that art historical, big steel sculpture stuff. And I also think it's really important to think about with regard to even what's here in the building, because these are meant very much to hold the marks of their experiences. They are very much meant to be works that kind of live with their stories on their surfaces. That, when you look at this, however many 8 years later or whatever it is from when it was made, that it talks about what it was like to live under the High Line and have skaters on it, etc. And wherever this goes next, it will, whether you burnish an edge or clean something up or take something off, it is going to carry with it the mark of its changeability. The other thing that I think is really, really interesting and worth talking about for this is that you are also talking about a kind of sculpture that is so monumental, has been seen in the public realm, but is not permanent. And that's a little bit different as well. The idea that this is a movable piece of sculpture at that scale is also something that I think is sort of a surprise, because it's meant to be site-specific originally, but then it has these different lives, and then it kind of goes away and it comes back, etc. So just interestingly, again, to think about the kind of art history of the genre, if you will, and what's differentiated. It's not usual that this kind of thing just pops back up. Although you did tell me that this is like nothing in terms of weight compared to these.
Yes.
So this is like easy.
Yes.
Easy to move around.
Yes, the un is half the weight of one of these. These are incredibly dense objects. When you navigate through them, do take a look at the flat side. That'll really give you a sense of the tremendous compression of these iron particles.
The other work that was also a part of the LACMA exhibition. Do you want to talk a little bit about
Yes.
this form?
So this is noun. It is a self-stabilizing form, although for the sake of public safety, it was mounted. But each one of them, practical. But each one of these forms was playing with a different form of sensory participation. Any way that I could use a certain line of sight or a line of experience to create a new experience, a different engagement. So in this piece, you actually step up onto noun, and you walk to its vertical plane and touch it from there. And that was also a point of permission too, because it is kind of an interesting sense of balance. And that last 3 feet, you feel like you might actually push it over as you're walking on it, but you will not. So that's another aspect too that I enjoyed of that encounter. Again, it's self-allowance, and because these pieces were not permanent installed, it's also that being able to take, to experience the moment when you're given it, to experience that moment, to be in the moment when you have it. Oh, maybe should I talk about that rust?
Yeah. No. Let's.
Okay, let's go.
So.
Genesis.
Okay. So wait.
Okay, yeah.
We'll go to this one.
Okay, so this was just installed. Yes, so literally, like a few weeks ago. This is Genesis. This is an homage to one of my favorite statements from a theoretical physicist named John Wheeler. Space-time tells matter how to move, and matter tells space-time how to bend. So this is another opportunity. You can see that cut again, like you see in known, that you see in un. And in this case, I just continue. I'm using the heated bend as a way to continually step outside and look at something from a greater and greater dimension.
And this, you walk through.
Yes,
You walk through, you walk up, you walk around. You are meant to experience that curve.
Yes.
The slight imbalance that you might feel in your body.
Yes.
It's nothing moves, nothing rolls, but there's this kind of consistent sense of impending movement.
Yes.
Or impending imbalance in a lot of these works.
And again, it's to trigger that moment as artist and also as experiencer. I'm joining us, right, as the same person, right? That moment between, again, sensory stimulus and definition. The artist and the experiencer.
So now we are there's another picture of it for everybody.
I always love rigging photos, sorry about that, but.
No, they're the most thrilling, actually, because that really does bring to light the kind of practical concerns of what it means to be working in a genre like this.
Yeah.
You also have to then get it somewhere, put it up, engineer it. So there's the making, the fabrication, but that's also a part of the story of all of these. That was a huge part of the story for this.
Yes.
So we're going to go through a few of these, but talk a little bit about these for us in terms of bringing us back to the idea of some of these works feel a little bit like, I'm going to show you what I can do with this stuff. right? With the material content, like what can I do to it? How can I manipulate it? How can I compress it? How can I break it? How can I cut it? How can I fold it?
Yes.
And these are a little bit smaller in scale than some of the things that we've been talking about, but I think it's really important to think about how you are pushing. The materiality is essential, and then you're pushing that materiality to its limits in a number of different ways.
Always pushing the tools to the limit, and then forcing new tools to be made, and then those are pushed to the limit, and then you make new tools, and then those are pushed to the limit. Collaborate with me.
It's really fun.
It's really great.
Really
Have a great
fun.
time. Actually, we do. Drink a lot of coffee. But these, let's go back and forth all these three pieces.
Sure.
So this is an interest, and also I'm not in putting these forward to you. These always are meant to be experienced together. You know, we're experiencing together what can happen with the medium. I'm not putting it to you. You know, we're experiencing that together. But these are great because this is when, and this is an evolution from the Proteus series. These are temperature and pressure series, where now I'm really in direct conversation with what will happen with an elemental metal, which when I mean by elemental metal, maybe I'll define that. So steel. Steel is actually made up of, depending whether it's carbon steel or Corten or stainless, as many as maybe 10 to 12 different metals. So depending on the recipe, a little more copper, you get Corten, you know, a little more tungsten, a little more chromium, you know, you get stainless steel. These types of recipes, right, endlessly fascinating for me. But I wanted to break that down. I wanted to isolate some of these metals, right? Just isolate them and be able to work with them like you would a pigment, right? So for me, I wanted to inform iron, all right, what would you do at this temperature and this pressure? Just a simple system. So one of these is cranked up to 6,500,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, which is this one, all the way down to 9,000 or 90 pounds of pressure per square inch. And the melting, the heat was just before its melting point, right? Taking the form just to the edge of melting and then informing it with pressure. So that's what these capture. These capture that so that we can experience that medium. Because remember, 4 grams of this medium resides in your body. And that's fascinating too. But, and what would happen? You know, what would happen? I loved this one, I particularly think is interesting because in order to be able to choose a certain pressure, we had to kind of go at it a couple of times in order to achieve that. I think this one's 28,571 pounds of pressure per square inch. And that was actually done by repeated marks. I loved that. Others were just more elegant. We could just do it in one. And ironically, that's the 6 million.
That's this one.
That's that one.
Yeah.
That was cool. I probably should have put a picture of how to do that. We'll work on that. Whatever. And this one, again, these are, the actual measurement is really sometimes of less consequence to me. I'm really about being able to communicate with the medium, and whatever that particular system is, then kind of denotes what I'm going to be working with as far as, you know, inches and, you know, pounds and things. But this is actually, you know, it can fit in your hand. I mean, you can't. I think it's almost 100 pounds.
I was about to say,
pounds.
right, exactly, the density.
But nonetheless, you know, compared to some of these other things that we've been seeing. So I really have there's no hierarchy of importance to me as far as that, as far as measurement is concerned. It's a sliding scale. It's just a sliding scale. I'm either working with it at this measurement or that measurement. You know, I enjoy that sliding scale.
Well, the next thing we have here is something that will really explode our sense of scale. And I think the reason to include this, as Christine talks about what this project is to also bring back the sense that regardless of what these forms are, what the process is, you are deeply engaged with the astrophysical. You are deeply engaged with these ideas of the universe and of the stars.
Yes.
Literally and as a kind of conceptual framework. And so if you could just give us a little bit of an overview of this, it's sort of, it's something to keep in mind in terms of the fact that the cosmos is a part of all of this work, even when it feels solid, earthbound, and very much about, the forces of gravity that are upon us.
So my homage to stars isn't something that is anything than a material homage. So imagine, I'm interested in what makes things, right? So we mimic how stars make things in many ways, whether it's the foundry cauldron or whether it's a tokamak. But for me, since they are what make metal, of course I'm interested. This is what makes my medium. So that's my interest in stars. This particular project is taking place in the south of France. It's been going on for about 30 years, and it's going to be completed in 2025. 35 countries have joined together to realize a miniature momentary star on Earth. I really wanted art to be a part of this process, but not in a formal sense of sculpture or painting. So kind of in the way that I go about things, I called the United States director. And
Christine's a caller.
I'm a caller, like a cold caller.
Hi.
Hi. To be fair, it does not work all the time, not even in the least, but when it does work, it's so smooth. So it's kind of like, all right, we were all kind of born to be part of certain projects. Each one of us has our part, and then there's things you can feel you're forcing and you just let go. Not meant to be. But this was meant to be. So I, again, as art is cultural infrastructure, I asked them very politely if art could make a contribution, but a serious, very serious contribution. I wanted to insert a moment, a sustained moment of art and science within the infrastructure of the site. But given the fact that it's a nuclear site, given the fact that this has been going on for almost 30 years, I wasn't asking to be part of something super important by any means. I just was asking if they would be interested in a proposal of how we could maybe work this out. That was about 3 years ago. And in that process, this intersection of art within their infrastructure has moved as a 400-acre site. And originally we were talking about something in like zone 7, like the parking lot, or whatever. Actually, it was never the parking lot, but okay. And then moving itself in, and I'm now at the edge of zone 1, which means now I'm at the edge of the heart of the mechanism. But what I did is I asked, could I work with somebody? Could you provide me whatever blueprints that you would like to provide me with so that I could look at what's making this form and select one, select a piece of infrastructure within the network of what you're creating, something that's shared by many others, right? I wasn't asking for art to form a super function, something that was only 8 of. This is, again, to be in a state of complementary conversation, but something that was shared with many, right? Maybe tens of thousands of a certain part, or hundreds of thousands of a certain part, and to allow art to be one of them. And so that process was amazing. At one point, they did want art to create one of something of 8. I backed out of that one. Only because out of respect of what was happening, I knew that the opportunity was a different one than that. What it is, and where I'm so happy, because it gets back to a conversation I had with Lisa about the 4 grams of iron that exist in the body, I'm now able to actually realize a 4-gram work of art, which is very very important thematically, conceptually, materially to my work. And it's this little bolt, and there's 80,000 of them. And art, not me, art is recreating it from an art historical perspective using art traditional means. It is exactly the same. It's going to go through all the same tensile and other testings, everything that it needs to go through, it will go through. It will fail, it will succeed, it will fail, it will succeed until it succeeds. And then it's procured just like all the other countries' works, because conceptually what's important to this is that when you have 35 countries contributing parts to this mechanism, each one does go about making it in their own way, and so will art. So in this way, this single piece is procured through the inventory. It's included in the inventory of the 80,000 other parts, and it is installed with its exact location unknown. So this is a lot of effort and a lot of collaboration to have this very interesting ending. And it's installing in September. The piece will be there in inventory this April. And they are in charge of the communication of this project, but they wanted me to know that they consider art the 36th country.
It's really wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to relative points.
Yes.
We're getting a little bit
Long.
later. I want to be able to open it up to questions. And so I think we should come to where we are.
Yes.
And what we're showing you here are some of the very early kind of pieces of conversation about what was this project going to be? Where are we going to put it? How are people going to experience it? What were the possible forms? What was the possible scale, et cetera? And it started with this idea of almost like an Easter egg, right? The idea that you would be kind of driving or walking down a street in St. Louis and you'd see this kind of monolithic, monumental relative point, and that would lead you to question everything. What is it? Where are we? What does it mean? Where is it pointing, et cetera? And we played around with this a lot. Should there only be one? Should there be three? How big should they be? What is the nature of what monumental is? And we talked about this for years and thought about that. But eventually we came to the idea that we wanted to bring them inside. We wanted these relative points, these forms to come inside. So much of Christine's work has been about that place outside, that public kind of access, et cetera. And there's a different meaning when you bring things into the white cube, right? And that it feels different, your interaction is different. The things themselves behave differently, right? Because they don't have to deal with, water and snow and wind and all of that. They are in some ways way more protected, even from our own human behaviors, right? Because we don't think anyone's skateboarding on them while they're here at CAM. And it was just this kind of conceptual framework of what happens if we take these huge ideas and bring them within the space of the architecture. And so that's how we got here. And the one thing that I think would be really, really great, we've talked about this a lot, but I think one of the things that's really great to think about is why this form. A lot of the forms that you have made are either cut, opened, folded, right? There's so much that you have done with forms that are not monolithic. And instead here, we have this kind of cylindrical form with this shallow point that is totally solid. It's not like Un where it looks big and heavy, but you walk through it, right? It's not like even that, 6 million pounds of pressure or whatever, but you can see the action upon it. It's truly, literally condensed self. So if you could just share a little bit about the 2, the 3, and the 4th dimension.
Yes, okay. So formally, and we've kind of been hinting on this, but this object gave me the opportunity to do this. So You're walking between dimensions. So you begin with your line of sight in the second dimension. You have a classical circle, which is 53 inches in diameter, and you have a classical square, which is 53 inches square. Then you can experience either the folding of the square or the extruding of the circle into a third dimensional cylinder. And then the fourth dimensional aspect is duration, which is how the form is pulling very subtly into that point. That's the idea behind what you're looking at in that way of its form. What was also interesting to me from a material standpoint is kind of twofold. One is you were just seeing those objects. I was talking to you about temperature and pressure. In this opportunity, which I'm so excited for because it's the first time I've done this, I zeroed out temperature, just zeroed it out as far as making the form. This is 100% pressure. So this is 10,000 pounds of compressed iron particles to a single point. So that was fascinating for me. So now the temperature.
I just want to say one thing. Christine has often described herself as a heat seeker, right?
Oh, yes.
That's your kind of moniker.
Yes.
And that the vast majority of works that she has made historically are through using heat and real heat, like heat that's the same temperature as the surface of the sun kind of heat. And so that statement in and of itself, that these are made only through force, that there is no heat, that's a kind of sea change.
Yes, and what I really enjoyed about it, and I mean, like technically, okay, if there's anyone technical in the audience, okay, yes, there's a little bit of heat involved in the process, but not like the surface of the sun, which is where I usually reside, which is 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is what's so exquisite about this work and why I'm so excited to have this here and with you, together with you, is that industrial tool that enables me to be able to work at the surface of the sun has been eliminated and replaced by the friction of your finger. That is a much more subtle source of heat. So this is what's so exquisite for me, because now the museum goer, in that experience between sensory stimulus and definition, now it's the heat of the friction of your finger that's informing the surface. It's no longer this industrial tool. Like symphonic for me, just loving it. So that's what's so important about, and it's also a much slower pace. From a material standpoint, the way that iron has been made has taken billions of years. Now, I can say that, right? That noise of me making words, saying billion, is just going right into our heads, and we're just moving on from that. But what if we just stopped for a moment and really took that in? What is the pace of that, materially speaking? What is the pace of that? And now it's here under my finger? Oh, man. So as a sculptor, like, this is the kind of way that my studio practice is, and we're joining together in that studio practice.
And the other thing that I think is a kind of extraordinary feeling and sort of overwhelming in certain ways is that you've talked very much about, why this form, which has the cylinder and this, the cube, the square, the circle, but it does have a point.
Yes.
And from the very beginning of discussing this exhibition, it was very important to think about why. Why have a thing with a point? Because a point points you somewhere, right? It gives you a trajectory that you look at. It makes you think about something. And here you have 12 objects, none of which are pointing in the same direction. And what that does is that makes us as viewers have to kind of think about where they're leading us and why. But by going from the macro to the micro, the macro of that is, of course, that you are still dealing with the cosmos and the universe, and the fact that as an infinite thing, it is centerless. So every one of those can be pointing to a center because there are infinite choices for that. There's nothing and everything inherent in that. And I think that that also helps us situate our bodies and the way that we move through the space.
You said it. That was perfect.
Last thing, and then we will open it up. Thank you for your patience. There is also another body of work in this exhibition, a body of work called Primer Gray, which is around the corner. And it is, in many ways, I think, the perfect both complement and foil to these relative points. And why don't you just describe the medium?
Yes. So I'm interested in Primer Gray because it is both a medium and a color. Again, super symphonic for me as an artist to be able to get my hands on something that is both, that's considered both, that functions as both, that exists as both, and to use that as paint.
And we were talking about the fact that in this very, very, in some ways, subtle, flat, beautiful, floating rectangle, there is this kind of blob that's created at the bottom on the right-hand side, and they're all different, this kind of accretion of the paint. And that is meant for us to really think about the forces here on Earth, gravity. So that, too, is a relative point. It is pointing us to the kind of very core of the Earth, which is one of these stars. And it's a kind of way to think about, again, literally our situation here on Earth.
Yes, and I will say there's a statement about 21st century alchemist that's kind of related to this exhibition, and this might be a good point to kind of do this. The art isn't teaching science. I have no desire whatsoever to teach science. But when you think of what alchemy is, or what it was from a historical definition, right? It's the space that exists before the science. So that's all that I mean by alchemy, is to explore the space before the science. And that's more true to where the space of this art resides.
We have a few minutes for some questions. Thank you so much for being here and for your patience. I believe do we have mics? We have a question over here.
I'd like to ask a little bit about the beginning of your practice. Interviewer said that you had studied anthropology. I wonder how you see your work now as an artist. How does it fit into the economics of our system, the gallery system? How you've been able to support yourself doing something that's very unconventional, with these shapes look like big bales of hay?
It's a very good question.
These are potent, powerful questions. They're really good ones. Wow. All right, the economics aspect. All right, so each one of us might have something that we're completely and totally devoted to, and you would put everything on the line in order to realize it. That's me in a nutshell. Doesn't mean that there's a sense of profit or lucrative aspect, or that it's even a great business plan. I would not say being an artist is like a given on being a good business plan. But with that said, it's devoted to the journey. So if you want to, like, specifics about it too, is that when I met Christopher Powers, who for 2 years we worked together professionally in fabrication. Just so happens that in our path we got married. That was a very interesting union specifically to me, in the way that now my partnership was not only marital, but also we were making work together every day. And so that was different. So I wasn't always going out and constantly reinventing who I'm working with, how I'm working with, developing that relationship. Although that's changed, I'm constantly collaborating, and I'm using new tools and new foundries. That's not our relationship, but that's been something also that's very important to note. And it's just how that happened, and the work has definitely benefited greatly from that relationship. I don't feel like I can really truly answer that in the way that's maybe super satisfying, because I'm still on that journey too, to be able to what that means. There's really good years and really bad years,
What is the role of your art, as opposed to, say, the paintings you used to do? Does it evolve from painting?
Yes, I mean, more and more my projects now are completely devoted to things that are closer to when I was working at NASA. So now, like the project in the south of France, I'm now really truly blending. So the idea of if something results as a sculpture or as a painting, these are terms that are starting to become really vague, and I don't know how to really incorporate that anymore. I'm just more evolving with how I can get deeper into working with the medium within the medium and where that goes, because it just all started by mulling paint, and just that's the studio practice. Okay, I don't know if I really answered your question.
A question here?
I'm intrigued by the portability of your sculptures and wondered if you could speak a little bit about, does the meaning move with them? Is the meaning in the interaction of the humanity alone, and therefore they could be anywhere? Is there anything related to the site that informs the work?
Yes. There has always been site specificity with every project, and that memory is contained within the surface of the work, and it contains the humanity involved with that experience at the surface of the work. This here, since the work has mainly been architectural in scale, the opportunity to be able to work within an architectural scale was fantastic, and that's what allowed me the opportunity to really invert my whole process here and to focus heat in a different way, temperature in a different way, to be able to increase that sense of pressure that's informing the medium. So incredibly specific to this site. And also the conversations that Lisa and I were having with the experience of iron and how we could have a monumental conversation with iron. So that's 120,000 pounds of conversation.
We have another one here and then here.
I'm curious, you started out as a painter, and I am very interested in how your experience of painting has changed. So how do you consider, you talk about like a very intimate, like textural experience with these works. So as someone who made like work that was traditionally shown on a wall, how has that changed for you over time?
Completely, everything has changed. Like, the way that I used to approach a plane is totally changed. Everything's upside down, sideways. My orientation with my line of sight is always changing. For sure, the works that are on the wall are sculptures, and for sure, the work on the floor is paint. Just figure that one out. But that's like, it's just this endless conversation, and I mean, it does have to be structured somehow, always trying to evolve a system that is coming with the work. So it is always dynamic, always changing, and I don't have that relationship with paint in the way that I used to, and I can't even really go back to that. I don't know if you've experienced that with your work too, when you're not really working how you were 3 years ago or 10 years ago. Yeah, totally different. totally different.
This gentleman in the front, and then I think we'll have time for one more.
Good morning. My question is a basic question. Is these paintings,
Yes, great.
are they hollow or are they
Solid?
solid?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
And what kind of paint do you use?
Okay.
And in the sculptures, steel, or are they are you on canvas?
Thank you. Thank you. So these objects are solid. They are completely solid. And they are a compression of, if you can imagine a mold, so the point on the cone is on the floor. Oh, okay. There's a picture here that shows on the upper left the orientation of how the form is made. So I'm pouring in a mix of elemental iron, other metals, and metalloids. And the reason why I included metalloids is they're vastly lighter than metal. If I hadn't had a little bit of a mix happening, these objects would weigh about 60,000 pounds or 70,000 pounds apiece. So just for the practical aspect and the transporting aspect and all of that, I had to work with what this was going to do to be able to even realize the opportunity. But it is solidly being fed into that mold. And it's the weight of the metal on top of itself, that grit on top of grit on top of grit, that is allowing it to be able to compress into form. And there is a small amount of binder, less than 1%, that, like paint, does allow it to keep its form longer than the 4 months. And that's another important part, too, is how is this going to exist safely in space here. So that is totally solid. The yes, well, I'm being a little wordplay with that, but the iron grit, I'm considering like I would pigment, like dry pigment. But it is a sculpture, in a formal sense. But I love that question, and also to your question, so the works on the wall, and thank you for asking, the substrate on that is also metal. Mm-hmm. One of them is iron, and the rest are aluminum. So thank you for asking that. So, yeah.
Yes, last question.
Hi, Penny.
Can I riff on your answer about what's on the wall and what's on the floor?
Yeah.
So rules of the gallery tell me in my head if it's on the wall, I'm not supposed to touch it.
Yes.
But what's on the floor, we can touch. So is there something about what you're doing with touch on the wall or what you're working with on the floor that's taking those rules that we think we know and asking us to do something different or think something different about that?
That's wonderful. Thank you. If you come to my studio, you can touch the paintings on the wall. But I think that it's important for the work here and the context here there's a lot of things happening here. So we're just saying that one would be more of an ocular experience, and focusing more of a broad sensory awareness to the works on the floor.
There's also something where these works are meant to change. They're meant to hold our marks, our experiences. We are meant to have experiences with them. And that happens through touch, but we're powerful, right? The oils in your hands, the heat of your hands really does change them. Whereas primer gray, part of what we have there is this kind of call to a monochrome painting that has a pristine surface.
Right.
And so it sort of needs to be left alone to maintain itself. These are meant
Right, you have to
to
control yourself.
evolve.
You have to control yourself. There is a level of control now. Now we have set a control standard, right? You can't touch the works on the wall, but you can touch the works on the floor.
And we don't know what they're going to look like at the end of the 3 months, 4
Yeah.
months. I mean,
Hopefully
maybe there
maybe
won't be
rust.
anything perceptibly different, but maybe there will. And they could have a little rust bloom, and they could have, some might be more loved than others by audiences, and that'll be really interesting too. We have some of them that, you know, a piece has come off and that's part of their lives. And so that will also be really interesting. Will that get bigger? Will it stay the same? Will we have that kind of loss somewhere else? And so they're living with us during this time at the museum. And that's what you want.
Yes, yep.
Okay, I think we have come to the end, and I thank you all so, so much for your patience, for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you to Christine. Go touch them.